Well, good morning again. On behalf of the Asia Foundation and the Korea Economic Institute, we're delighted to welcome you to this webinar, marking the release of our report and policy recommendations on ESG and sustainable finance in South Korea. My colleagues and I are especially pleased to partner with KEI in co-hosting this morning's event. We're privileged to regularly engage with Ambassador Kathleen Stevens and her team at KEI, two of whom are with us as panelists this morning. I'm standing in this morning for my dear friend and colleague, John Brand. And many of you know John as a regular fixture in moderating foundation events of this kind. And while I have a face for radio, John has the face and voice for film and television, but this morning his voice has temporarily abandoned him. We wish John a speedy recovery. This morning's session will begin with a brief introduction from me, followed by panel presentations by featured speakers and a question and answer session. You'll note from the chat post that we'll be taking questions via the Q&A channel located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We ask that you identify yourself by institution, and if you wish, direct your question to a specific panelist to the group as a whole. Our Zoom platform includes accessibility features, which we have posted details in the chat space to ensure full, inclusive access by all. So the Asia Foundation has a long history of engagement in Korea. In the environment arena, while many policy announcements have been made, Koreans continue to live with unhealthy air and greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis that are well above the OECD average. Many are looking to the recent rise of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG standards, as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address social and environmental challenges. But some challenges remain, including greenwashing, using ESG more for marketing than for its genuine social impact, and lack of regulatory clarity. Each pose significant barriers. And compounding the confusion is the sheer proliferation of ESG standards, with more than 600 now in practice. So to address these challenges and the opportunities to which they portend, a group of leaders from the public, private, and academic sectors gathered over the course of a year to formulate ESG policy reform recommendations that included a presentation at the National Assembly earlier this year. Our panel this morning of distinguished speakers is going to include several specialists. You have their bios in your invitation, so I won't introduce them in any detail. It's safe to know that they're each distinguished specialists and very able to speak to these issues. We're going to hear first from my colleague Kwong Kim, the Asia Foundation's country representative for Korea. Kwong will be turning over to Jin-Ho Chung, Chairman and CEO of the Wells Investment and co-chair of the ESG policy group for IFB Seoul. Jin-Ho will in turn hand off to Randall Jones, non-resident distinguished fellow at KEI and professional fellow at Columbia University's Center on Japanese Economy and Business. And then finally, Randall will be turning over to Troy Stangerone, senior director and fellow at KEI. And then finally, after our panelists speak, Danny Leipziger, the managing director of the Growth Dialogue and professor of practice of international business, George Washington University, will be moderating the Q&A session. So with this brief welcome, Kwong, I invite you to present.
Thank you so much, Kim, and good morning, everyone, and good evening. And my presentation will present the issue of ESG in the context of global and regional perspective or context before we talk about Korea specifically by Chino. And to do that, let me start with a few quotes that reflect a few things we've been hearing here in Korea and Asia about ESG. One person in a working group mentioned that ESG is great for a happy society and for people to sleep well, but ESG is making business leaders to lose sleep. This is a reflection of the compliance and the requirements for businesses to make alterations of their businesses as ESG trends grow. But another leader said, I've been looking to find new economic and social models for Korea's future. ESG could be a platform to guide the next generation's rise for a future. And there are always people who are more cynical, who says that ESG is just another form of CSR. And this is a reflection that ESG is perceived in a very complex ways in Korean society. I think it's important for us to talk for some definitions about what ESG, impact investment, and sustainable finance is. There's a lot of confusion about this topic, and so that we are more or less on a similar page. ESG, as proper, is generally associated with public equities or index, a more passive form of investment. And ESG is generally focused on input measurements and not output or impact. That's what is called ESG factors. And there is a lot of focus on negative screening in terms of what companies investors will not invest. And that's called exclusions. For example, in the area of tobacco or companies that pollute. So those are exclusionary screening or divesting investments. One of the criticisms or concerns about ESG is that if, for example, ExxonMobil sells off an oil refinery, it is merely, even though it gets credit for not getting into the dirty oil business, it hasn't really solved the problem of dirty oil. Somebody else is taking over that business. So that's one concern about ESG, which we'll talk more about later. Impact investment is more generally associated with private equity, venture capital, or even social impact bonds. It's a much more active form of investment. And a different to ESG is often associated with greater focus on impact measurement. And the type of impact is much more customized and measurable. From the point of view of companies, the ESG, again, is usually focusing on listed companies. They're usually larger firms, and they're very much compliance-driven versus impact. And again, is much more as an input factor rather than output. Impact investment includes companies of all sizes, from small and venture to private equity. So there's more flexibility in terms of the size of the companies. And impact is generally at the center of a business model. Not always the case, but it's generally the case. And there's a lot more sense of partnership with investors in created impact. So those are some general differences. There's also other instruments, financial instruments in fixed income space, such as green, sustainability, and SDG bonds. These are much more fixed income type of instruments where you raise funds, private or public, to fund specific thematic purposes. All of these, you could say that they are part of a category called sustainable finance, and they all share the common aim to have a double bottom line of impacting business and society or environment, and some type of a long-term orientation. But again, as you can see here, the boundaries are not always very clear, and you can see why sometimes the definitions can be confusing. There's one more quick slide about definitions, is that ESG, the advantage of the ESG is that you can achieve scale. There's about, I think the last I heard is $41 trillion on ESG allocated assets around the world, which is huge. Impact investment just passed $1 trillion this year. So ESG can achieve scale, but it's somewhat limited to quantify impact. On impact investment, you could quantify impact more readily, but it's harder to achieve scale. The hopeful news is that the future is that there is something called that people are aspiring to ESG 2.0, where there will be both scale and impact. We haven't got there. That's the holy grail. And there are different movements from the ESG angle in improving the measurement metrics, such as impact-weighted accounting, where companies can measure the non-financial societal costs and contributions in an accounting books after all the profits and EBITDA are calculated. Those are, which will be potentially a hugely impactful to larger companies on the ESG space to move to scale at the same time impact. On the impact investment, there are more and more impact investment companies, firms and companies scaling up, better ways to scale their models to achieve both scale and impact. So there are movements on both sides, but I wouldn't say that's mainstream yet. But right now, there's somewhat of a trade-off between ESG and between scale and impact. So why does ESG matter to Asia and Korea? Asia is the most dynamic region in the world at the moment, as you know, and Korea, one of the most dynamic countries. At the same time, Asia is home to the largest number of the world's poor. And also, even though Asia has 35% of the global GDP, it has 53% of carbon emissions. So it's a disproportionate share of carbon emissions. And about 1 billion women lack access to finance. So it's estimated that about $1.5 trillion is needed annually, this is a calculation by the UN, per year, to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So that's a huge gap that, as Danny and others know, that it's impossible for one government or even governments combined, and as well as the multilateral development institutions. If the annual budget of bilateral and multilateral agencies, it's only a fraction needed from this amount. So public sector alone cannot meet this challenge. The good news is that you have an increasing number of companies and investors who are willing to support responsible investment. This is the growth of signatories of UN's Principle for Responsible Investment, UNPRI, and this has been increasing the assets under management of the signatories. It's more than 90 trillion. So that's the good news. A fraction of these, in theory, could address the gap that we just mentioned. So what's the picture in Asia, though? So while the sustainable finance space and social responsible investments in Europe and North America has a pretty good share of the total assets, up to a couple of years ago, even in East Asia, the share of assets that are socially responsible were only a very, very tiny fraction of total assets. And that means that East Asia were very much behind, both Japan and the rest of East Asia. At the same time, there's a lot of room to grow. And this is around the time when I came to Korea. And when I saw those numbers, it was very clear that this space was a lot room to grow in Korea and East Asia. And that's one of the reasons why the Asia Foundation and other colleagues with Chino, we launched the Impact for Breakfast Network, a network of investors and impact investors in Korea and Seoul. So what's really driving ESG and impact investment and sustainable finance? One is the generational change that in terms of consumption, that consumers, especially the younger generation, the millennials and Gen Z, are demanding much more socially responsible, environmentally responsible products. And the labor force is looking for purpose beyond profits. And significantly, capital ownership, that right now, as you speak, there is the greatest transfer of wealth in history as millennials are receiving wealth from the baby boomers. And the millennials have very different ideas about how to utilize the capital. And that's pressuring institutional investors and really the blue chip investors to adapt. And that's one big shift in demographic that's pressuring this rise of ESG impact investment and sustainable finance. And second, and these are not completely unrelated, but there's also a discontent with single metric capitalism. And as you know, a lot of high profile failures of capitalism, as you see in these images. And as this ESG grows, more and more people are a fear of missing out, FOMO, and following the trend. So a lot of the growth of ESG in Korea, for example, lately has happened through FOMO. And Korea was very, very quiet on ESG and impact investment up until last year or even 1.5 years ago. And then there was a sudden interest in growth of ESG. And suddenly we started seeing more people coming to our meetings, and especially including asset managers who actually were not necessarily interested in ESG, but because their bosses attended a meeting in Davos or similar forums, and they're ordered to look into ESG more. So that's been a lot of fear of missing out, and because everybody's doing it, people are obligated to follow. So there's a lot of that going on as well, especially in the latter stages of ESG. Before I pass my floor to Chino to talk about Korea, which is why most of you are here, I wanted to just share a little bit about some of the concerns and criticism of ESG, because I know this is going to come up. And one criticism is that ESG is more marketing or greenwashing than really about impact. And you had some high-profile cases of organizations, and it's not just Deutsche Bank, but several other organizations have been accused of greenwashing. And second, there's an active debate right now in terms of what's the right role of business society. Is ESG a legitimate role or mandate of a business vis-a-vis government? Who gave them this mandate to the good in society? I mean, I think those are healthy questions. And who keeps business accountable? So those healthy questions. Although I might add that an interesting question than this is, what's the right role of the government vis-a-vis the companies, so the private sector? What's the right role between public and private? And that's what motivated us to issue this report on ESG policy recommendations. And this is, again, very valid criticism, is that there's no standardized approach on ESG. Right now, you have different rating agencies that rates companies like Tesla. One rating index it's at the top of ESG, and in some it's not even there. It's not even considered an ESG company. So there's no standardized approach to measure. But again, the hopeful movement is that there is a big effort right now of consolidating some of this major measurement and standardization of ESG that's happening right now. And finally, and there's probably more, but I'm just listing a few here, and is that there is lack of clarity about the ESG values, or whether it will be consistently stable across geographies and time, whether for example, the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda will be really applicable to different geographical and cultural contexts, for example. And also over time, whether the current indicators of ESG, even in environmental areas, in the future generations, will keep this ESG factors the same. So there is lack of clarity whether these ESG values are stable across time and space. And I mean, there is a lot of noise about political agenda and so forth, but I think there's and I think we need to distinguish about, in terms of the noise versus, I think there's some real questions that it's important for us to consider. So thank you, and I would like to pass the word to Chino to talk about Korea.
Thank you, Kwang. I'm Chino Chung, the chairman of the Wealth Investment, a venture capital and private equity investment firm in Korea. Prior to my current role, I developed my career in investment and asset management in Wall Street, Japan, and Korea. Since 2021, I have co-chaired a policy working group under Impact for Breakfast Seoul. Impact for Breakfast is a global network of family offices, funds, and intermediary organizations with a common focus on strengthening the sustainable finance ecosystem. IFB started in London since 2008 and expanded today to multiple cities around the world. Our policy working group that consisted of leaders from different stakeholders in the financial landscape gathered regularly to address systematic ESG challenges and opportunities in Seoul, Korea. Looking at the composition of our members, there are various types of pension fund CIOs, social entrepreneurs, executives of large companies, environmental experts, lawyers, professors, and lawmakers. Through 10 breakfast meetings over the past 15 months, we have selected the most common and critical issues and discussed them from various positions and struggled to come up with solutions. It was a really serious breakfast meeting in my life. In result of a series of productive discussions, we developed a set of policy recommendations that were presented to the National Assembly in April this year. In today's presentation, I will provide a key summary of the recommendations based on our working group's common perspective. To provide some context on the landscape of ESG in Korea, obviously ESG is hot in the Korean society today. Over the past 2 years, the number of ESG-related internet inquiries has increased by almost 6 times compared to previous key trends such as CSV, created shared value. Also, the ESG funds in the Korean capital market has soared 33 times to $7 billion in 2021 alone. The government is also responding to such trends, as there have been over 24 new proposed legislations submitted to the National Assembly since late 2020. Now, here comes the big question. Is the recent rise of ESG in Korea a once-in-a-generation opportunity, or will it lead to even more severe challenges? The global ESG pressures may imply great short-term vulnerability for Korean economy, a dilemma that makes policy coordination difficult for the Korean government. Although Korean companies receive strong pressure to comply more with the ESG requirements from both global and local stakeholders, subjectively complying to all of its requirements may lead to significantly negative business impact. For example, the rising requirements for green operations are especially critical for the Korean economy, which is centered around the semiconductors and heavy industries. In fact, the Korean Peninsula is geographically disadvantaged for alternative energy sources compared to EU and the States, making renewable energy procurement cost over 4 times in Korea compared to the international price average. One member of our working group, a senior staff from Korea's leading company, noted that complying to global environmental trends entails trillions of dollars of cost increase for its business. Such impact in cost competitiveness in the global market made the decision to go green very challenging especially given that its key global competitors from countries with more advantages in environmental compliances were growing rapidly. Therefore, our policy working group's interests were not only on enabling Korean companies and investors keep up with the global ESG trend, but also on balancing such effort while considering the national competitiveness in Korea. Here, our working group focused on the hopeful factor in Korean economy, the venture industry that has been fostered over the past decade. The high growth of environmentally friendly healthcare platforms and ICT industries has accelerated the reorganization of Korea's industrial structure. Currently, ICT industry already accounts for 13% of Korea's GDP versus 5% in OECD. One of our working group's hypotheses is that concentrating policy supports to vitalize such landscape can foster significant innovations in Korea for global ESG impact while strengthening the national competitiveness. Based on such perspectives, the IFB Policy Working Group concluded that the Korean government should make a preemptive and strategic policy so that large companies can respond to a global ESG trend while maintaining its global competitive advantage. Furthermore, financial authorities need policies that encourage innovative ESG-friendly ventures to grow high by leveraging chaebols, balance sheet, and private capital efficiently. Given above assessment of Korea's ESG picture, followings are an executive summary of the policy recommendation by our IFB team at the April National Assembly. Next chart, please. Number one, develop a government ESG strategy as part of the broad sustainable finance sector to guide the private sector and civil society. Consider establishing a control tower to support the strategy. We believe that having a central body composed of experts in relevant stakeholder groups will enable a data-driven and research-based legislative actions that are related to ESG. We suggest that the Korean government benchmark EU's technical expert group. Number two, conduct an impact evaluation of Korea's sustainable finance policies. Although active policy actions are ongoing in Korea, including provision of subsidies and grants, our policy working group believes that there is a risk of government's market distortion. Therefore, we strongly recommend that the government closely assess the impact of its policy initiatives to ensure that its policies vitalize, not distort, the ESG market. Number three, align investment tax credit or incentives with the strategic plan, including to support small and medium enterprises. Among carrots and sticks, we have accessed that many policies, both in Korea and abroad, were concentrated on sticks, regulations, and compliances. Our working group observed that the SMEs face strong pressures to respond to such requirements, unlike large conglomerates that have sufficient resources to do so. Number four, take the lead in developing a sustainable finance taxonomy. While efforts have already made progress and are still ongoing, including the development of K taxonomy and K ESG index, our working group identified existing gaps, including further integration with global standards such as EU's ESMA, European Securities and Market Authority. Number five, establish regulatory guidance on compliance and disclosure standards. This also includes developing a single access point for data disclosure and guidance that are closely linked to international standards. Investors should be able to access a company's ESG performance based on unified standard and data. A potential benchmark case study is European Single Access Point, ESAP. Number 6, facilitate liquidity and exit for venture capital. A potential example for intensifying this is to ease IPO process in Korea New Exchange, CONEX, for SMEs that meet certain level of KESG performance. Number 7, promote ESG awareness. The importance of ESG and the level of understanding should be consistent among all stakeholder groups. Finally, number 8, strengthen the role of the central bank in sustainable finance. The Bank of Korea could enhance its leadership role in the landscape by guiding other banks and financial institutions toward environmentally and socially responsible investments. As an example, the Bank of Japan announced its new climate program that provides 1-year zero-interest funds to financial institutions for loans and investments, especially on sustainable financial products such as green bonds. To wrap up my presentation, ESG has become more necessity rather than a matter of choice for Korea. The global requirements to align investments and business activity is something that needs to be solved collectively by all relevant stakeholders, including business leaders, government, investors, and society as a whole. Key challenges such as cost still exist. If preemptive policies are designed and implemented at an early stage of the global rise of ESG, such trend can become an opportunity to strengthen the national competitiveness of Korea down the road. I will stop here and pass the floor to Randall.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here and to participate in this conference. And I appreciate very much the comments made by Kwang and Jean Ho. I think this report, which I enjoyed going through, was very incisive. I was pleased to note that it cited the 2018 OECD Economic Survey of Korea, which I happened to write. Maybe Olivia, I'm having trouble with my slides. If you could maybe put them up for me, that would be all right. I noted that in this 2018 survey, we cited a study that showed that the Korean government gives lots and lots of money, and it is basically trying to help the SMEs to become stronger and more productive. But a study shows that the companies that actually receive this aid have a worse performance. They're less profitable, and this large government assistance to SMEs, the small and medium-sized companies, actually keeps the non-viable companies alive and doesn't really help raise the productivity. And so I like the conclusion in the report. It says we should focus on policy quality rather than on funding quality. Focus on the policy rather than the funding quality. And it said ESG criteria for investment by socially conscious investors can have the same problem that the government has. With that in mind, I went to the report, and page 34, 35 has the key areas in the government strategy for ESG. And looking at them, I like the next slide, please, Olivia. I like the focus on greenhouse gas in the first section. And as you probably know, Korea has a new nationally determined objective of cutting greenhouse gases by 40% by 2030. The target had been 26%, and now they have a much more ambitious target. And this is hard because, as Jean Ho mentioned, Korea's economy is based on very energy-intensive manufacturing industries, and the resources in Korea are not well suited to developing renewable resources. And so we have a severe challenge here. Looking at the amount of reduction Korea needs to get to this 2030 target, let alone the 2050 carbon neutrality, they would have to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 4.2% a year. In contrast, the EU only has to cut by 3% a year to get to their 2030 target. So Korea has this huge challenge. We look at what instruments are going to get Korea to the 2030 target, and we find a lack of a carbon price. Korea has an ETS system, but in the 21-25 period, 90% of the permits are given away for free. They're grandfathered rather than being auctioned. And this target, the number of permits, is not linked to the 40% target. And the other problem is the electricity price, which determines to a large extent how much electricity people use and how much greenhouse gas emissions. For the last 10 years until a few months ago, the electricity price was basically frozen. So the question is, how is the ETS going to transfer its impact into what happens in the companies? And so I think there's a big role for ESG to try to overcome this roadblock and try to promote investment in new green technology and other ways to try to meet this target. Turning to the social aspect, Olivia, the next slide, please. The one item I caught my eye was the gender wage gap. As they put it, the female remuneration ratio. And so as you probably know, the gender wage gap in Korea is the largest among the 38 OECD countries, about 33%. So this is a huge problem. Korean women are exceptionally well educated, so you really can't blame them in terms of their lack of education. And so this is a problem that really needs to be addressed. And well, as at the OECD, we talked about how companies need to be more transparent about what their gender wage gap is. I think ESG is a good way to try to bring that openness and transparency into the private sector and try to narrow this large wage gap. The next slide, please. This wage gap is partly due to non-regular employment. And that's another thing on the government's strategy is the percentage of regular workers. So in Korea, women, 47% of Korean women who are employees are non-regular, as opposed to 31%. And this drives the gender wage gap. The next slide, please. If we look at the regular workers, on average, per hour, they only make about 72% as much as the regular workers. And it varies between the fixed term and other categories, but this is a huge wage gap because there's not much evidence that they're less productive. The next slide, please. And they also don't get the social insurance benefits to the same degree. They don't get company bonus payments, company pensions. So this is really the source, in my view, of Korea's income inequality problem and the gender problem. Now, the question is, how can we overcome it? And in this area, I'm not sure that ESG really has the ability to overcome it. Companies hire non-regular workers because, first of all, it provides workforce flexibility. It's very hard in Korea to dismiss a regular worker during a downturn. So they rely on non-regular workers for this flexibility. And I think this is something that ESG will have a hard time overcoming. And so this is the area I think the government can't rely on ESG. I think the government needs to make the difficult steps to try to reduce the incentive for companies to have regular workers so that we can move towards a system of a single contract and try to get rid of the distinction between regular and non-regular. The next slide, please. So I guess that's the end of my comments, and now I'll turn the floor over to Troy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Randall. And first off, I'd like to thank John Brandon and Kwon Kim for reaching out to KAI for us to work with you all on this release. I'd like to commend the paper to everyone. One of the things often when you see reports is that they will take and look at an issue, but they won't necessarily get into many specific details. This is a very detailed report. It has more than like 2 or 3 recommendations at the end. So I would like to just commend everyone to read this. Now, what I'd like to do in a few brief moments is to take and come at this a little bit and touch on some of the things that, you know, Kwong, Randall, and Jinho have talked about, maybe expand a little bit on them, and bring a little bit into this on also some of the polling that is in the paper, as well as some that's in the United States. Um, you know, I look at this largely from the climate perspective, but Randall's touched on the social side as well, and I think governance is going to be important going forward. All of these play a key role. But when you think about climate change, you know, Randall had mentioned the 40% target for emissions reductions and how challenging it is. We have a paper out by Dr. Soo-Gil Young on the challenges Korea is going to face, referencing some of the things that Randall's talked about in terms of how quickly Korea is going to have to take and reduce emissions and the challenges in doing that. But one of the key things is that we're at sort of also an inflection point for that. And what I mean by that is that during the Yoon administration, if Korea is not able to reduce emissions, it will not be able to take, or if it doesn't meet its 2030 targets, it will not be able to take and meet its 2050 goal to reach carbon neutrality. So this is a critical period. One of the key things the Yoon administration has done is to reinstate nuclear power and put that back into the energy mix, but it's also taken a lesson to renewables. And we've seen some of the challenges that Korea faces in doing this, but I think this is something that's probably going to have to be readdressed over time if Korea is going to take and meet its goals. Now, we can take and debate sort of like the importance of climate change and whatnot, but I think that there are certain practical factors that really push into this. And, you know, when we look at the broader market, Kwong talked about investors, and I want to touch on investors a little bit later on, but there are also corporate pressures at play that Korea faces. When we look from the external side, you know, companies such as Apple have taken and essentially put in place requirements that their suppliers start moving towards reaching carbon neutrality. And so this isn't simply going to be a pressure or a question rather of, is this something that Korea should do domestically, or is there public support in Korea? There's going to be not just governmental pressure, but also external corporate pressure. And so when we think about why a company like Apple is important, Samsung and SK provide chips to Apple for its iPhone and other products. So if Samsung and SK are not able to take and meet Apple standards, we're going to have challenges where Apple's going to begin looking for other suppliers who can meet those challenges. So there's simple corporate questions here at play in terms of profitability in the long run. Also, when we've talked about briefly, sort of Kwong in his remarks earlier discussed, you know, the differences in standards that different countries have, different international organizations have. But the G7, the G20, and IOCO have all endorsed the International Finance Reporting Standards Foundation's efforts to try and develop a standard through the International Sustainability Standards Board to really develop a criteria for a global baseline on sustainability information. But even beyond sort of this global effort, there are other practical things at play. The EU announced earlier this year that it has a draft for corporate sustainability and due diligence that's going to be coming out, which will apply to companies in the EU. But more directly, next year, the German Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive will come into force. And in essence, this will require German companies to know their supply chains and understand whether they're meeting these types of requirements. And so as these things come into play, it's going to place more pressure on Korean companies to take and be able to take and meet the goals of ESG. So the questions are Korean firms prepared for this shift? Well, according to the Korean Chamber of Commerce and Industry, over half of Korea's exporters are not prepared for the ESG requirements that their contractors may place on them. 77% of companies said that they had only made low-level preparations should their contractors reach out to them for inspections of their operations. And one of the biggest obstacles they face is the lack of ESG professionals for supply chains. So in essence, there isn't an infrastructure in place, and I believe Jinho touched on this some, for really companies in Korea to be able to take and make sure they're meeting these objectives and be able to take and deal with them when their partners abroad reach out to them to see if they are in compliance. Now, we've also talked about this question about profitability and cost. Whiting Case, a major law firm, has analyzed 2,000 academic studies of ESG and found that in 70% of those studies, there was a positive correlation between ESG and profitability. So while there are costs in terms of setting up compliance and reaching or the ability to take and provide information on whether you're meeting compliance standards. This is something that in the long run will likely be to the corporate benefit of companies in Korea. But as Randall and others have mentioned, this will probably be challenging for SMEs in South Korea. One of the things I'd like to, before turning it over to discussion, talk on is some of the polling data in the paper, and also then look at sort of how we see this sort of in the United States and polling data here. So when we look at the polling data, 86.2% of millennials and Gen Z said that they purchase product from companies in Korea with strong ESG performance if the price is the same as competing products. Now, the polling I've seen in the United States is more on investors, but among investors in the United States, it's not quite as high, but you see similar levels of support of investors saying that in their personal lives, they would like to try and incorporate their values into their daily lives. So similar type of concept of trying to take and, frequent companies that are ESG aligned in terms of their activities. Now, when you look at the United States, one of the challenges is from the investor perspective, most investors are still taking and focusing on the profitability of those investments. But that being said, over 50% said that if their pension funds or other investment vehicles offered them ESG alternatives, that they would be open and interested in taking and engaging in those types of activities. So while you're seeing some of this play out in the United States and in Korea in terms of preferences, there is more movement towards this, and it is going to be, I think, fairly strong as younger generations, as Kwang said, start inheriting wealth, looking towards their investments and how they want to take and put those investments forward. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Danny for questions.
Well, thank you very much to both our presenters and also to our discussants. I think this is a very strong report, but it also shows some of the difficulties that one faces in this area, not the least of which is the fact that ESG sort of combines three different elements, right? And the metrics that one would use to look at environmental goals, as some of you have done, is one thing. Looking at social goals, as Randall did in the case of women in the labor force, and there are others, would be a second. And then governance is sort of an overarching kind of concept. So I think the report does a good job of explaining the difficulties, but I think we have to acknowledge that if one were designing programs from scratch, one probably wouldn't take three separate connected but also separable issues and put them into one, because that makes the difficulty of regulating, providing standards, and assessing how firms can meet these standards all the more difficult. So with that, I would like to come back to Kwang and Junho first, but then others can chime in and pose the following question. A lot of what you're asking government to do is important because firms are unlikely to act in the absence of some general policy and directives, but it's not clear to me that the government's policies are all that clearly defined. And I think some of the charts we saw show that Korea's got a ways to go, particularly on energy, particularly on women in the labor force, and I would say also on governance. So in all these areas, Korea is, I would say, a bit far from the frontier. So my question to the presenters of the report is the following. First of all, are there countries out there or standards that you think Korea should emulate? So Troy just mentioned, what's happening in the EU and in Germany. I think it could help Korea, to know what's best practice and how far away from those best practices are they. And secondly, what is it that you'd like the Yoon administration to do? They may not be able to respond to all the recommendations, but what kind of signals would you like them to give? Just as an anecdote before I turn it over to either of you or both of you, I'm reminded that President Eamon Bach created a presidential committee to deal with environment and green growth. Young Soo-gil was the chairman, and this was all aimed at the export sector, but very little was being done inside Korea to improve some of the environmental standards. So I think the leadership of government is really important. And as you have both said, the private sector is looking to government for this kind of leadership. So can I ask you what it is that you would like to see the administration do? Juno, maybe we start with you since you're more connected perhaps to the government. You need to put on your mic.
Yes, when we made presentation at the National Assembly, we both had a very unique time, useful time among us. At the time, the congressman from who was head of Korean ESG committee members like Kim Sung-ju, Jo Jung-ho, Jo Hae-jin, those senior guys joined us, and they listened to us very carefully, and they had some very empathy with us. We shared the dilemma of the Korean government and Korean economy. But in the end, I think still Korean company itself has dynamism. If we're looking back past the 30 years, there was zero production in Korea after Korean World War. So Korean company itself has dynamism, and Korean labor also has dynamism. For example, having said that the Korean Peninsula has very lack of the advantage of the renewable energy resource, but for example, the Korean large companies, 21 conglomerates already signed up RE100. The RE100 have about 386 companies recently joined, but out of 386, 21 Korean conglomerates already signed up. So Samsung and SK, they have been prepared to survive from this trend. Samsung Electronics, for example, based on the Korean Yonhap News Media survey, they has already converted 100% of its power to renewable energy in the States and China and Europe. But overall conversion rate of renewable energy remain very low still due to low use of renewable energy in Korea. So I think Korean conglomerates will have a strategy, maybe shifting their production factory from Korea to other outside of Korea, somewhere in Europe, or I'm not sure. But so I think Korean company itself will have a dynamism to move forward despite this disadvantage of the environment peninsula of Korea. And the government also will adjust, deal with Europe and the US of this movement, maybe compromising the speed of the ESG compliance issues or the speed. But as Randall mentioned, Korea has still issues of labor market as well, and we need to improve the gender discrepancy. But still, in that issues, I personally, as a local Korean, if you look back 20 years ago, the woman's labor wage was way lower, maybe 40% versus 100%. So now it has been improving very, very significantly. So it is kind of dynamism in Korea. So I'm sure Korean labor structure also will change very rapidly. Also, women's wage also will increase substantially from here. So we will see some convergence in that side as well. Maybe I stop here. Kwang, you can add something.
I'll be very quick on that answer. If there's a single thing that the Yoon administration could focus on, and it's just probably politically the trickiest, but it's to establish the control tower on ESG. And so that this is not just a preview of one ministry or interest group, but it's something that can have an overall strategy as a country, not only in terms of the financial institutions to be compliant or the major companies to be compliant, but also ensure that the positive competitiveness strategy of Korea, especially in this rising startup scene, where a lot of the energy in terms of especially private equity and venture capital, there's a lot of opportunities of Korea differentiating from other countries in this space with technology and innovation. So I think a control tower help consolidate and coordinate not only financial institutions and multinational and larger companies, but also a real strategy to make Korea more competitive with its new sources of growth and startups.
Well, thank you both. I think we get further insights into the problem from you both. I think the fact that Samsung and SK are much more aggressive in trying to meet some sort of sustainability targets on energy outside of Korea compared to inside Korea gives us one important data point. And I think, as you said, Dr. Kim, you can't separate out innovation and startups from the problem. On the one hand, you want to focus on the big guys because they have more resources, they're more visible, they can help you get to certain targets. On the other hand, a lot of innovation occurs with smaller firms. And so that just highlights the fact that you can't separate these issues out from innovation, competitiveness, the role of gazelles, a lot of other issues. Let me come back to our discussants and perhaps dig one level deeper. So Jinho, you mentioned that the wage gaps were even worse in the past. True, good news. But we have to match that off with the fact that Korea now has the lowest birth rate in the world. So there's something going on with women in the labor force that goes beyond the wage gap. So I wonder, Randall, if you might want to amplify a bit your view on what women's labor force participation is all about, and maybe link it to demographics. And then I'll come back to Troy with a follow-up question as well. Randall?
Yes, as you mentioned, Korea's birth rate is extremely low, 0.8, and is creating a lot of concern about the pessimism among young people. And I think it goes back to the fundamental problem that it's difficult for a woman to combine a family with a regular job. And so the Korea working style of long hours, total commitment to a company, it makes it hard for a woman who wants to have a family to be a regular worker. So I think it goes almost to a cultural question of trying to achieve this work-life balance that we've talked about for so long. Korea's working hour, the legal maximum per week, has been cut from 68 to 52. But when you add in long commuting times and socializing after work, being a regular worker is still a very intense burden. So I think it's something that'll be hard for the government or ESG to address, is how to achieve work-life balance. I know in the US, there's some companies that advertise to attract high-quality workers by saying we're a work-life balance company. Intel, for example, they say they hire two people to do one person's job, and they allow a lot of work-life balance. So this would be hard for either the government or ESG to get involved in this issue or try to resolve it. But it really goes to the core of Korea's labor market system. In terms of women, the demographics will force women to come into the labor force. In Japan, for example, the participation rate of women has risen by 9 points over the last 15 years, but 2/3 of them are non-regular. And so the wage gap in Japan, though not as large as Korea, is still significant. And there's still a lot of discrimination against women. And so the labor shortage will also cause companies to hire more women, but we want to ensure the quality of that employment, not just the quantity. And so in Korea, of course, the share of women who are managers or in the parliament, the National Assembly, is extremely low. So it's a question of quantity and quality in women in the labor force to narrow this gap.
Yes, very true. Thank you, Randall. Troy, you were focusing on the competitiveness issue and the fact that there are going to be new demands placed on Korean firms to, verify their supply chains to meet certain targets. And you had this White case study that you referred to. I guess I'm trying to link this up with what Kwang said at the beginning, which is that East Asia is the most vibrant region still, but it produces a lot of carbon. It has a lot of disparities, but it's also, a third of the planet's GDP and growing. So from a competitiveness point of view, Korea often responds to its competitors, obviously Japan is historically a strong competitor, but also what's happening in China and now in Vietnam and other places. So how do you see Korea dealing with these issues in a more concrete way, which the report is recommending? I mean, the report, I think, is unique insofar as it goes beyond saying all the nice things, but it's actually saying, these are the 8 areas that government should change its policies on. So it's in Korea's own interest, but there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between what business is being pressured to consider and what government is actually doing with these myriad of regulations and poor enforcement and lack of clarity. So can you give some advice? Well, let's say we put you in the room with the Minister of Finance or with Han Duck-soo, and you've got to explain why it's in Korea's interest not to be the last in this area, but to move to the head of the class.
Well, I think one thing I would say is that there is a deeper long-term issue in Korea to where we have a one-term presidency, and we often see, even when you have changes within political parties, that there is a desire to take and move away from the policies of the predecessor, or at least to de-emphasize them. And I think one of the things I would say to Han Duck-soo or anyone else in the Korean government is, where has the Moon administration taken efforts to take and address some of these issues, be it either climate initiatives they've taken, other issues, Randall mentioned the reduction in working hours, that, you should maintain. There's been discussions about loosening some of the reduction in working hours now that President Yoon is in office. Does that make sense? Does that give us the policy stability we need to take and reach these goals? So the first thing I'd say is, what are we doing right, and how do you take and then continue that? So let's not change what's working just for political or ideological reasons. We need policy stability. Second, I would say one advantage that Korea has is that its corporate sector has been very good at shifting when it needs to. If we look at Hyundai and Kia, they were 2 of the last companies to take and really look into building electric vehicles. But that being said, they've quickly taken and adopted technology and taken and become relatively competitive in both the United States and Europe. And actually, the EU is the largest export market for Korean EVs. So, the corporate sector can adjust, but I think the government needs to be looking where are these trends going. And so if we know that the Europeans are going to take and put in place certain strictures, it would behoove Korea, one, to take and be reaching out to its partners in Europe and discussing with them what are common standards that we could come up with on these issues. If you're going to go this way, what makes sense for not just you, but for more partners involved. So engage with your partners abroad. But then two, as you're doing that, start taking and aligning Korea's policies as best you can with where you know the markets are headed. So that way, not only are you ahead of the curve, but you're signaling to your companies that, okay, you were successful on EVs and making that transition. We may not be successful in every transition. So, let's try and make sure that we're at the front of these curves rather than behind. And one little quick thing I just want to add on what Randall was saying about the integration of women into the workforce. In 2019, so just before the pandemic, the IMF put out a study to where they looked at integrating women into the workforce. And I can't remember if the deadline was 2030 or 2035 off the top of my head. But the key point is that if Korea was able to take and integrate labor force participation of women to the level of men by that deadline, it would add 7% to South Korea's GDP. And so to give you an idea of roughly how significant that is, and 7% of GDP is significant, at the time of the report, that was essentially what South Korea spent on healthcare. So better integrating women into the workforce is not only a social goal for that reason, but it's also an economic goal that will help South Korea's economy grow going forward. So I just wanted to kind of add that as well.
No, absolutely. When you look at the potential growth rates, basically it's capital, labor force participation, and technical progress. That's one of the three major variables. And the bad news is that this has been highlighted to the Korean government for 10 or 20 years, and obviously there's some reluctance to deal with it. And Randall's point that Japan, which used to have the worst labor force participation rate for women in the OECD, has now improved itself, should give some lessons for Korea. I have two final questions. I see we don't have much in the chat box, so I'm going to continue to try to lead the conversation here. So I wanted to ask Kwang a question, and then Jin Ho a question, and then we'll open it up for any final comments that any of you have. So Kwang, I liked your graph there on impact investing versus scale. My question really, however, is that impact investing, when you think about it, and people are marketing it, we do impact investing, they're often looking at how it affects individuals. We do impact investing, we provide credit to, female farmers, or we do such and such. So it runs a bit antithetical to scale, because you're trying to, get impact on the ground, whereas what you're trying to argue with ESG is that you'd like to see scale because you want the impact to be felt by society more broadly, right? So it's sort of a little bit, who's the beneficiary? Is it society, or is it the individual, household or region or segment of society? So what's your view on trying to get impact? And you want to get to that northeast part of your graph. So what do you think needs to be done to make these two measures work more hand in hand than in the past? You're on mute.
Thanks for that question, Danny. There's already good efforts happening, both on the ESG group or the institutional investors, multinationals, as well as on the private equity venture capital, which knows both worlds. So there's movement in both sides to make that happen. I mentioned impact-weighted accounting. So you only manage what you can measure. That's the old saying in business, right, and economics. So I think having new accounting standards, marketing, for example, wasn't even considered an asset decades ago, and it was until you start gather the intellectuals, the artists, the hippies together and creating this brand, and you could actually value it. So I think it's a matter of time where ESG or non-financial account lines after the EBITDA line in an accounting books started to be taken more seriously and monetize them, so that people can see the cost and additions to the balance sheet in terms of what ESG factors are being taken into account. So I think that's one area, and on the impact investment side, so there is a lot of effort to scale, and I think a promising one is some of you may know about social impact bonds, and these have been actually. So I know this recently. There are several success cases in Korea in terms of creating jobs, in terms of reducing learning disability and so forth. So they are very targeted and scale efforts to increase scale in terms of the impact. And I can go on and on. You could argue it by groups, but it's also thematic. Environment or urban regeneration. I was involved in a fund in Panama that does exactly that. So these are very, very, very customized and varied and rich. And I think that's rich ecosystem, and I think that great innovations can happen to scale.
Thank you. That's very helpful, very interesting. Let me turn to Jinho. On your 8 recommendations, I think 7 of them one can easily agree to. I want to focus on number 8, the role of the central bank. You know, this has been controversial with the European Central Bank, and central banks are under a lot of pressure these days, just trying to deal with stagflation, and your own bank, the Bank of Korea, under a lot of pressure as well, which is a topic for a separate seminar. But what exactly would you like to see the central bank do? They've got a hard enough job trying to fight inflation, deal with the depreciating won, not hurt Korean businesses or households that have a lot of mortgage debt with interest rate rises. Now, on top of this, you want them to consider ESG. How practical is that, and what specifically would you like them to do?
Well, fortunately, Korean Bank of Korea has not fully leveraged so far. They have leveraged certain level of the money into the green bond or those type of environmentally, socially favorable investment so far. So I think personally, compared to Bank of Japan or Bank of, I don't know, EU, Korean, the power and authority of Korean Bank of Korea has much higher powerful than any other countries. So, but still they haven't leveraged well about public sectors. So at my knowledge, I think they will still have room to spend the resources into this ESG side. And also on the top of that, I think aside from that, my personal opinion, Korean conglomerates, Korean chaebol has quite high level of foundation money, family foundation money over the past 20 years, estimate about more than 50 trillion won, that has been fully leveraged. So when he discussed with one of our congressmen, we were thinking about make a proposal like American, the PRI, the program, the investment or mission investment type of things. We want to propose to the government that leverage the Korean conglomerates foundation money, certain money, percentage money into the Korean ESG or environmental or socially favorable investment as well. So I think both sides, there is still room to leverage the resources into the ESG side as well.
Could I just add on top of that, you know, there's a big knowledge
Yes.
agenda that the central bank could play as well, where they have a fantastic research arm and research teams, and having central bank and they're already issuing reports, but I think they could play a more of a leadership role in terms of generating knowledge, research about ESG in Korea and around the world. Because of Bank of Korea's influence, the signaling effect of increasing role of the central bank could have a very important role for the economy.
Very good. Thank you. No, I think that gives more meat to the recommendation. Thank you both. I think we're at the end of our time, so I want to turn it back over to the Asia Society's Kim McQuay to offer his final views.
Thanks very much, Danny, and a big thanks to all of our speakers today for walking us through this complex topic, but one that is not only fraught with some challenges, but I think, as we've all heard today, some pretty remarkable opportunities as well too that lie ahead. And I hope that the combination of the report and today's dialogue and the ongoing conversations will be really helpful to Korea as it takes these bold steps going forward. So thanks to all of our speakers, and a big thanks to Danny as well too. It's always a delight when the moderator brings his or her own extraordinary depth of knowledge. And I think, Danny, the questions that you posed, in addition to those that were coming in, were all excellent. So thanks to everybody. Again, thanks to our KAI partners and co-hosts for the event. And for those that don't subscribe to the Asia Foundation's notifications of events of this kind, please do be in touch with us. We have programs of this kind on a variety of issues spanning our work across the 3 regions of Asia and now the Pacific. And we're always delighted to welcome new guests to our programs. So a big thanks to all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.